They gave me the south maintenance corridor on my first day, and I took it without complaint. It was a long hall, maybe 200 meters end to end, with crystalline walls that caught the palace light and threw it back in slow, shifting bands of violet and pale gold. Beautiful if you had time to look at it. I didn't. I had 40 meters of floor tile to mop, a utility closet that smelled of the local solvent they used for the grout lines, and a schedule that said I was expected in the east wing by the fourth bell. My name is Myra Solon. I was 58 years old when I took the janitor position at the Vethaal Imperial Palace, and I took it because the pension from 22 years of structural inspection work on Earth had covered exactly what pensions cover, the basics, and not much beyond that. And the salary for a human maintenance worker on the Vethaal homeworld was nearly triple what I could have earned doing equivalent work back home. My knees were not thanking me for the work, but my knees had not been thanking me for anything since I was 44, so their opinion on the matter had ceased to carry much weight. The mop they issued me was too long in the handle by a good 6 centimeters. This is the kind of thing that sounds small but isn't if you're mopping 200 meters of corridor every morning. A handle that's too long forces you to work at a slight angle, loading one hip more than the other, and over the course of 6 or 8 hours that angle accumulates in your lower back the way water accumulates in a low place. I made a note to requisition a shorter handle on my second day. The note sat on my supervisor's desk for 6 weeks before anyone responded. That was fine. I had learned in a long life that most things moved at their own pace regardless of what you wanted from them. I had spent 22 years doing structural inspections on Earth, mostly on the eastern seaboard, where there was always old construction that needed assessment, and not always enough budget to bring in the large firms. I was not the kind of engineer who stood in front of boards and pointed at projected schematics. I was the woman who went out to the site before the meeting, while the dew was still on the rebar, and put her hands on things. I tapped walls. I walked floors and felt for the soft spots, the places where the substrate has settled unevenly, or where a void beneath the slab lets it flex in a way that sounds different under your heel. I learned to listen to concrete the way some people listen to music, hearing the difference between a sound that was solid all the way through and a sound that was hollow somewhere behind it. You can argue with a lot of things in structural work, but you cannot argue with what the stone tells you when you knock on it. The technique is old. Engineers much older than me worked it out. The percussion method, the tap test, called different things in different traditions, but all the same essential idea. You don't need instruments. You need a knuckle or a hammer or whatever is in your hand, and you need to listen, and you need to have trained yourself to hear the difference between the sharp, even return of solid material and the duller, slightly muffled return of a void or a separation behind the surface. The difference is subtle. It took me probably 3 years before I could catch it reliably, and another 5 before I trusted myself to mark a spot without doubting it afterward. By year 15, I could walk a wall and tell you within about 30 centimeters where the hollow was. I had retired from that. Or rather, the inspection company I worked for had been acquired by a larger firm, which had in turn been absorbed by a consortium that had decided my division, small project structural assessment, the bread and butter end of the business, was not in keeping with the consortium's strategic profile. My redundancy package had been calculated to the decimal point and arrived in my account on a Wednesday. On Thursday, I had applied for 3 positions I didn't get, and on Friday my daughter had called to ask how I was doing, and I had told her I was fine, which was mostly true. What I was, more precisely, was at loose ends in a way I hadn't been since I was 22. I had always worked. The work had always been there in a specific and physical sense. There was always a building to assess, a wall to tap, a floor to walk, and its absence created a kind of quiet in my daily life that I didn't know what to do with. The posting on the Interplanetary Labor Exchange had been my daughter's idea. She had read about the expansion of the off-world labor markets and had sent me the link with a note that said, "Just to see what's out there," which was her way of not telling me directly that she thought I was going to go mad sitting in the flat. She was probably right. The posting for maintenance staff at the Vethaal Imperial Palace had not been prominently listed. It was a quiet posting, a few lines in a subcategory of the skilled labor section, and what caught my eye was the line that said, "Prior experience with structural assessment preferred," which I had not expected to see in a domestic maintenance listing. I applied. They responded within a week. 6 weeks after that, I was on a transit ship heading for the Vethaal homeworld. The apartment they provided was small but clean. The work, my orientation coordinator told me, was straightforward. I was to maintain the cleanliness and minor upkeep of assigned palace corridors and their adjacent service spaces. I was not to enter restricted areas without authorization. I was to direct any structural concerns to caretaker Veth, the head of the maintenance staff, who would pass them along to the palace's Department of Structural Integrity. I found out later that the asterisk prior experience with structural assessment preferred asterisk line had been a legacy phrase in the posting, left in from some earlier version of the job description, never updated, and that nobody in the palace administration had given it particular thought when they listed it. That was fine too. The Vethaal are a tall people. The shortest adult I encountered in my first week stood a head above me, and most were considerably taller than that. They have pale silver-gray skin with a faint luminosity to it, not a glow exactly, but a quality like moonlight on water, as though the skin is catching light from somewhere you can't quite locate. Their eyes are a deep malachite green, very still and very clear. They move with the unhurried deliberateness of people who have a lot of time and know it, a species whose healthy members can live to 700 or 800 years and who have learned over that span to be measured. They are not unkind. They are simply certain, in the way that very old aristocracies tend to be certain, that the natural order of things places them near the top and everything else somewhere below, arranged in a hierarchy whose lower reaches they do not examine too closely. A human maintenance worker on the palace staff was, to most of the Vethaal courtiers and functionaries who noticed me at all, roughly equivalent to a piece of well-maintained furniture. I was expected to be present, functional, and invisible. I did not find this insulting. I had spent 22 years being invisible on job sites. You learn things when people don't notice you're there. You learn the shape of a problem before the meeting where everyone will argue about it. You learn which concerns the specialists mention to each other in passing that never quite make it into the formal reports. You learn what the structure itself is trying to tell you, because nobody stopped you from listening. The crisis with the dome began 3 weeks before I found the fracture. I heard about it obliquely at first, in the way you hear about things when your staff in bits and pieces, from the conversations of people who walk past you without looking. The great throne hall of the Vethaal Imperial Palace is topped by a dome of structural crystal, grown over 3 centuries from a seed lattice implanted in the original foundation stone. The Vethaal grow crystal the way other civilizations grow wood. It is a living material for them, shaped and coaxed and annealed over generations by crystallographers whose training spans decades, using techniques that were already old when the dome was first begun. The dome at its apex stands 9 stories above the throne hall floor, and it is translucent as pale blue glass, and at mid-morning the light of the Vethaal sun enters it and spreads through the hall in long, cool shafts that shift across the mosaic floor as the day progresses, throwing the inlaid patterns in and out of brilliance. 3 weeks before I found the fracture, a junior crystallographer doing routine maintenance work in the dome's upper inspection gallery had noticed that one of the crystal panels was resonating slightly out of phase with its neighbors. He'd run his standard instruments over it, gotten readings that didn't match the historical baseline by a margin that was small but consistent, and filed a report. The report had gone up the chain. The chain had escalated it, first to the head of the palace's Department of Structural Integrity, then to the lead crystallographer, then to the lead superior, and from there to the palace administration proper. By the end of the first week, 7 senior crystallographers from the palace's own department were working the dome, along with 3 independent master architects retained on emergency secondment from the Vethaal Academy of Structural Arts. By the end of the second week, there were 17 of them. They had brought instruments I didn't recognize, long-armed resonance wands that they moved in slow arcs across the crystal surface, devices that emitted a faint subsonic pulse and measured the return, handheld spectrometers linked to a processing unit the size of a small vehicle that sat in the center of the throne hall on a wheeled platform, its status indicators blinking in complicated sequences that I gathered meant something to the people reading them. There was also a portable growth field generator, which I understood was used to check for internal stress patterns in living crystal, and 2 of the specialists operated what appeared to be acoustic tomography equipment. I recognized the broad concept, if not the specifics. The Emperor had been moved to the lesser audience chamber on the palace's east side for the duration. The throne hall was sealed to all but essential personnel. I was not essential personnel. My corridor assignment didn't include the throne hall. It didn't even come close. But the maintenance routes in an old palace are not logical things. They grew up over centuries, built around additions and modifications that came in without master plan, routed through whatever passageways were available when the need arose. And the south maintenance corridor that was my primary assignment fed into a utility junction that also served the throne hall's mechanical systems. The pumps that circulated tempering fluid through the crystal's internal lattice to regulate its growth rate. The humidity exchangers that kept the hall's atmosphere from drying the surface layers, the lighting arrays. Every morning, at the start of my shift, I passed the junction door that connected my corridor to the passage running around the throne hall's base. And every morning for 2 weeks, I heard the sounds of 17 specialists on the other side of it. I want to be precise about what I heard, not the sounds of confident technical work proceeding toward a solution, the sounds of confident technical work beginning to feel its confidence erode. The Vethaal are not a shouting people. Their voices don't rise the way ours do when frustration mounts, but there is a particular quality to their speech under pressure, a clipped precision that becomes staccato, the conversational equivalent of short, controlled movements, and I had learned to recognize it. By the end of the first week through the junction door, I could hear the staccato quality in voices that had probably, in ordinary circumstances, never had it. By the middle of the second week, I could hear it in all of them, at all hours of the day. On the 17th morning, I stopped outside the junction door and stood there for a moment longer than usual. The voices had gone from staccato to something quieter and heavier, which I recognized as a different register of the same problem. When people have argued their way through all the positions and run out of new things to argue, and the silence between the positions starts to widen. I went on to my corridor and did my shift. On the morning of the 18th day, things changed. I came to the junction at my usual time, just after the first bell, with my bucket and my too-long mop. The door to the throne hall maintenance passage was ajar. This was unusual. It had been sealed with a magnetic latch every previous morning. The latch logged in and out when the specialist's equipment was moved through. I stopped and looked at the gap. Through it I could hear not argument but silence, which was a different and more troubling sound. Then I heard one of the crystallographers say, in a voice that had passed through frustration and come out the other side into something quieter and darker, "We are going to lose the dome." No one answered. The silence after the statement had a specific weight to it. I stood outside the door for a long moment. Then I picked up my bucket and went in. The throne hall maintenance passage is a low-ceilinged tunnel that runs around the base of the hall's interior walls, below the level of the mosaic floor. It is accessible through a series of service hatches, and connects to the junction door I'd come through, which opened onto the tunnel's south branch. I followed the tunnel south to the service hatch on the hall's interior wall. The hatch was unlatched. I pushed it open carefully and stepped through. The throne hall was dim. They had powered the lighting arrays down to reduce thermal variation in the crystal during the investigation period, and the great dome above was a pale ghost of itself, its usual shifting colors muted to a soft, even pewter gray. Without the full light moving through it, you could see the dome structure more clearly. The articulation of the panels, the way the crystal had grown in slight directional waves that followed the growth field's contours from century to century, laying down record of its own making like the rings of a tree. I stood in the doorway and looked up at it for a moment. Then I looked at the room. The 17 specialists were arrayed around the base of the hall's 4 main support columns. The clusters had the particular formation that I recognized from long experience, not the formation of people actively working, but of people who have stopped working and are standing very close to the problem and trying to think of something new to try. The instruments were largely set aside, the resonance wands lying horizontal in their cases, the spectrometers folded, the acoustic tomography units dark. The large processing unit in the center of the floor had a single status light blinking amber. None of them noticed me come in. I was, as I said, furniture. I put my bucket down quietly near the wall and looked at the hall. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it is easy in retrospect to make it sound more deliberate than it was. I did not walk in with a plan. I had not been thinking about the dome on my way through the maintenance passage. I had been thinking about the grout in the East Wing's third junction, which had been repaired 6 weeks ago, and which I wanted to check before the end of the week, and about whether the humidity exchangers on the North Gallery were running above tolerance. I had noticed a slight film of condensation on the crystal panels their 2 days running, which might mean something and might mean nothing, but was the kind of thing that benefited from a closer look. I had not come through the service hatch with the intention of solving the problem that 17 structural specialists could not. I had come through because someone had said they were going to lose the dome, and I had heard them, and the door was open, and I had been taught, over 22 years, that you do not walk past a structure that is telling you something. It is difficult to describe what you learn to see, or rather, what you learn to feel after 22 years of putting your hands on structures and listening. It is not magic. It is not intuition in the mystical sense. It is pattern recognition built from 10,000 inspections, from the memory of every floor that had felt slightly wrong underfoot before it cracked, every wall that had resonated half a tone flat before the hidden void behind it was revealed, every beam that had looked sound from the outside and been compromised 3 centimeters in. You build a library over the years of what sound means. Not just the sounds you hear with your ears, but the sounds you hear when you put your hands on something and knock, and listen with your whole body to what comes back. The library grows in ways you don't always track consciously. You absorb things on job sites that you don't know you've absorbed until years later, when you're standing in front of a problem, and the library opens to the right page without your asking. I had spent the better part of 22 years standing in front of structures and letting the library open. I had learned to trust it. I looked at the dome, and I looked at the 4 support columns, and something in the accumulated library of my 22 years told me to look at the south column. I can't give you a satisfying reason for why the south column and not the others. I can tell you that it was positioned closest to the service hatch I'd come through, so perhaps I was simply looking at the nearest thing. Or perhaps the way the reduced lighting fell on it showed me something my eye caught before my mind did, a very slight asymmetry in the way the column's surface reflected the ambient glow from the processing unit's amber status light. Whatever the reason, I looked at the south column, and something about it nagged at me. Not dramatically, not obviously. The way a word you've spelled correctly 100 times suddenly looks wrong when you stare at it too long, some quality of wrongness that is more felt than seen. I walked over to the south column. It was a thick pillar of the same structural crystal as the dome, hexagonal in cross-section, rising from a worked stone base to the gallery level 9 meters above. The surface was smooth as glass when I put my hand against it. I ran my palm up the column to shoulder height and higher as far as I could reach on tiptoe. Nothing remarkable. No unusual temperature differential, no vibration, nothing that announced itself. I went back to my bucket. I took out my mop and turned it around so I was holding it by the mop head with the handle extended like a rod. Then I walked back to the south column. I tapped the handle against the crystal at the base. The tone that came back was even, clean, the solid return of a column that was sound all the way through. I moved the handle up about 30 centimeters and tapped again. The same even return. 60 centimeters, solid. 90, solid. I was working the east face of the column, the face that was most directly under the dome's primary load path, heel to toe, incrementing upward in careful steps. 1 meter 20, solid. 1 meter 50, solid. 1 meter 75, solid. 2 meters, I stopped. I went back and tapped the section just below 2 meters again, and again. At 1 meter 80, there was a change. Not a hollow sound exactly. Crystal doesn't hollow the way concrete or masonry does. When you tap a void in concrete, the sound drops into itself, noticeably flatter and more muffled. Crystal is more subtle. What I heard was a very slight flattening of the primary return, and beneath it, almost too faint to name, a secondary resonance that wasn't there in the sections below. Like a note played on a string where someone's fingertip is barely resting against it, not muting it, but altering the overtone structure. The change was present over a span of about 20 centimeters and then gone. I tapped the section again. Same result, again, same result. I reached into my overall pocket for my chalk stub. I used chalk for marking service items that needed attention, damaged grout mineral deposits on the humidity exchangers, cracked tile adhesive. I made a horizontal line on the crystal at the bottom of the anomalous section and another at the top, marking the boundaries as precisely as I could judge them. Then I stepped back and looked at what I'd marked. I had been tapping for perhaps 6 minutes. No one had looked at me. I was furniture. Then I heard footsteps. One of the crystallographers had noticed me. He was young, still early in his first century from the look of him, with the silver-gray skin of his people, and a formal inspection coat that had probably been immaculate when the investigation began 18 days ago, and now showed the small signs of long hours and close work. He stopped about 4 meters away and looked at me with the particular Vethaal stillness. That means someone is deciding how to respond to something they haven't categorized yet. "What are you doing?" he said. "Percussion survey," I said, "tapping for voids and laminar separations." He looked at my mop handle, he looked at my chalk marks, he looked at me. "That method," he said carefully, "is not used in Vethaal structural assessment." "I know," I said. "It's a technique from Earth inspection work, but something's different in that section. You'll want to put an instrument on it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This column has been surveyed 11 times in the past 18 days with a Velar-calibrated resonance wand. The results showed no anomaly." The Velar wand. I had heard them argue about the Velar wand on the 3rd day of the investigation, through the junction door. A 20-minute argument between 2 of the senior crystallographers. One of them insisting that the Velar-calibrated equipment might not be correctly parametrized for this specific growth batch of crystal, which had an atypical lattice density per the original construction records, and the other shutting it down on the grounds that the Velar wand was the palace standard and deviating from the standard during an active investigation would compromise the data integrity. I had stood outside the junction door and listened to the whole argument, mop in hand, and then gone on with my corridor. "What frequency range does the Velar wand operate at?" I said. He told me. I thought about that. It was roughly in line with what I would have expected from a high-end resonance instrument. Good sensitivity across the range, where most structural failures announce themselves, because most structural failures are bulk events. Cracks propagating through solid material, voids large enough to produce a significant return, delaminations wide enough to alter the primary propagation path. The velar wand would catch any of those cleanly. What it would not catch, what I had never seen a high-frequency instrument catch, in 22 years of work, was the particular secondary resonance of a very thin separation plane in a medium where the primary signal travels fast, and the separation is narrow enough that the reflected wavefronts arrive back almost simultaneously and cancel each other out at the wand's operating frequency. At high frequency, the round-trip path difference across a thin separation is small enough to produce destructive interference. The anomaly, in effect, hides itself from the instrument by being too small for the instrument to resolve. A mechanical tap doesn't have that problem. It sends energy across a broad spectrum all at once. The thin separation resonance is still there at low frequency, still distinct, still audible to an ear that has learned to listen for it. The instrument sees nothing. Your knuckle hears everything. The secondary resonance from a laminar separation in crystal, I've only worked with earth-grown synthetic crystal, so your natural crystal may behave differently, but the physics should be similar. It tends to manifest well below the velar wand's lower operating bound. The wand's calibration is correct for what it's designed to detect. This particular failure mode is just outside that detection window. A mechanical tap is broadband. It doesn't filter. You hear the full return. He looked at my chalk marks again. "You may be correct," he said at last, in the careful way of a person who is not sure they are not humoring someone, but is also not certain they're not. Or the chalk marks may correspond to a section of the column that is structurally sound, and your method may produce false returns. "That's possible," I said. "I've had false returns before. That's why you put an instrument on it and see." He turned and said something in Vethaal to the nearest cluster of his colleagues. They came over. There were 4 of them, and then a 5th, the senior crystallographer, recognizable by the weight of her inspection coat, a woman whose bearing made it clear she was the one the others aligned to when the alignment mattered. They gathered around the south column and looked at my chalk marks and at me, and the senior crystallographer asked the young crystallographer what was happening, and he explained in Vethaal that I spoke only partially, though I caught the words for mechanical and frequency, and one word that I didn't recognize at all but that caused a reaction in 2 of the others. A quick glance exchanged. The kind that carries meaning between people who have been working together long enough to have a shared vocabulary of glances. The senior crystallographer looked at me. "Show me," she said, "in basic for my benefit." I tapped the section again, slowly, starting below my lower chalk mark and working up to the upper one, 1 centimeter at a time. I moved the mop handle in a steady rhythm against the crystal surface, not hard, just firmly enough to produce a clean contact. In the sections below and above the marks, the return was even. In the marked section, the faint second tone was there. She put her bare palm against the column, flat, centered on the marked section, and held it there. She was very still. Then she said one word in Vethaal, very quietly, and I didn't know the word, but I knew the tone. Another of the specialists produced an instrument I hadn't seen them use, a flat contact sensor, mechanical rather than electronic, with a gauge set into its face and a dampened stylus mechanism for reading surface resonance at low frequency. She pressed it against the column, centered on my marks. They all watched the gauge. The needle moved. I will not try to describe what happened in the room in the next few minutes, because I am not sure I have the words for it. 17 people who had been arguing for 18 days went silent all at once, and the silence had a quality to it, not defeat, not relief, not quite either, that I had felt before on job sites, in the moment when the thing you had been looking for and not finding reveals itself at last, and you see it, and you understand what you are dealing with. It is a moment that is both very good, because now you know, and very bad because now you know. The senior crystallographer turned and looked at me. "Where did you learn this?" she said, in Vethaal slow enough for me to follow. "Earth," I said, "structural inspection. 22 years. She looked at the chalk marks. She looked at the gauge, which had moved to a number that meant something to her that I couldn't read. Then she looked at me again, and there was something in that look I am still not certain how to name. Not gratitude, quite. Not awe, quite. Something more like the expression of a person who has just heard a piece of information they should have had a long time ago and are working out how to accommodate the fact that they didn't. "Thank you," she said. I nodded. I picked up my mop and my bucket. The east corridor wasn't going to do itself. I found out afterward what the fracture actually was, the full technical picture, which I asked for because I wanted to understand what I'd found. And the senior crystallographer, to her considerable credit, sat down with me 3 days later and explained it in careful detail, switching between Vethaal and basic when my vocabulary ran short. The south column was not fractured through its full cross-section. It was what the Vethaal called a laminar separation, a plane of disconnection between two crystal growth layers that had failed to fully bond during the column's initial growth phase, approximately 280 years ago. The laminar plane ran diagonally through roughly 40% of the column's cross-section at the section I'd marked, starting at 1 meter 80 and running to about 2 meters 15 at its highest point. It was a growth defect, the kind that happens when the environmental conditions during crystal growth shift slightly between one layer's formation and the next, producing an interface that looks continuous from the outside, but has not achieved full molecular bonding. The reason it hadn't been found in 2 centuries of standard inspection was that the velar resonance wand, which had been the palace standard for 90 years, operated at frequencies above the band, where the laminar plane's anomalous return was strongest. The wand was excellent at detecting the standard failure modes, bulk cracks, surface fractures, void pockets larger than about 5 centimeters, but it was effectively blind to the low-frequency secondary resonance of a laminar separation. Its own sensitivity range had been established based on the most common failure types in Vethaal structural crystal, and a laminar separation of this age and character was uncommon enough that nobody had thought to calibrate for it. The reason it had become urgent now was load shift. The dome had been growing, living crystal adds mass continuously, at a rate the crystallographers measured to precision, but which amounts, over decades, to significant additional load at the dome's base. And the growth over the past 30 years had shifted the primary load path through the dome support structure by a small but consequential amount southward. The south column was now carrying proportionally more load than it had been built to bear, and the laminar plane that had been a latent defect for 280 years was beginning, under the increased stress, to propagate. Without intervention, the crystallographers estimated, the column would fail within 8 to 16 months. The dome, 9 stories of living structural crystal, 3 centuries of growth, would come down. The repair took 11 days. They injected a crystal bonding medium through a series of precision boreholes drilled along the laminar plane's extent, following the diagonal path that the contact sensor, and afterward, the full suite of instrumentation had mapped in detail. The medium was allowed to cure under a localized growth field. The Vethaal have techniques for working with structural crystal that have no human parallel, and watching the repair crews operate was like watching surgeons who had been doing surgery for 100 years. And then the bond was annealed at elevated field intensity until the laminar plane was consolidated throughout its extent. The contact sensor's gauge reading improved over the first 4 days, then held steady. On the 11th day, the senior crystallographer filed the completion report. On the 12th day, the Emperor returned to the throne hall. I was not there for any of this. I was mopping corridors. I was summoned to the Emperor on the 14th day, after I'd found the fracture. The summons came through caretaker Veth, who knocked on my apartment door at the end of my shift. Unusual, since he communicated through the duty roster as a matter of practice, and told me, with a careful neutrality I had come to recognize as the face he put on when something had happened that he thought required the neutrality, that I was to present myself at the lesser audience chamber at the third bell the following morning. "What's this about?" I asked. "I was not informed," caretaker Veth said. "I spent the evening doing what I always do when I'm uncertain about something. I cleaned my apartment, which took 40 minutes, and then I sat at the small window that looked out over the palace's secondary courtyard and had a cup of tea and thought about what I was and was not worried about. Not dismissal. I had gone into the throne hall without authorization, yes, and I had put chalk marks on a 300-year-old structural crystal column, yes, but the dome was still standing and the repair had been completed and the emperor had returned to his throne. Palace administrators handled dismissals. You didn't get a summons to the emperor for a dismissal. Not the formal recognition ceremony that I suspected was coming, either. I had been through enough of those in 22 years. Safety certifications, years of service acknowledgments, a letter from the Port Authority building office once when a report I'd filed had caught a void in a load-bearing column 4 weeks before the building was to be occupied, and the repair had cost considerably less than the alternative would have. I knew how recognition ceremonies worked. They involved a certain number of set pieces and a certain amount of standing up straight, and they were not in themselves troubling. What I was, if I am honest, was tired. Not from the work was the work, and I had always been fine with the work. Tired in the way you get tired when you have been invisible for a long time and are about to be visible again briefly, for a thing that you had done without thinking, because it was simply the thing to do. The attention is its own kind of weight. The eyes turning toward you, the formal acknowledgement, the record of it, all of it is a version of being looked at, and being looked at after a long time of not being looked at requires a kind of internal adjustment that costs something. I went to sleep at a reasonable hour. The lesser audience chamber was smaller than I'd expected, not the vast, crystalline ceremonial hall I'd imagined, but a long rectangular room with a coffered ceiling and tall, narrow windows that let in the morning light in clean, vertical bars. The floor was polished stone, simple. There were chairs along one wall, and at the far end a low platform with a single seat, and a man sitting in the seat who was watching the door. Emperor Vethaal of the Vethaal was older than I had expected from what I'd heard of him on the staff corridors. About 400 years into a lifespan that a healthy Vethaal might carry to 700 or 800, which put him at a rough human equivalent of mid-50s. He had the silver-gray skin of his people, fine-boned but not frail, and his malachite green eyes were the still, clear eyes of someone who has paid attention for a very long time and found it worthwhile. He wore formal robes in gray and deep blue without ornament, no crown. I had heard that the Vethaal Emperor didn't bother with a crown inside the palace as a matter of personal preference, and the man in front of me looked like someone who had preferences about things and held them quietly. In the chairs along the wall sat the senior crystallographer and 4 others from the investigation team. To one side stood 2 palace scribes with their slim recording styluses, positioned with the stillness of people who are present in an official capacity and know it. I stopped at the threshold. The emperor looked at me. "Myra Solon," he said. His basic was careful and precise, the kind of precision that comes from a person who has learned the language properly and not from one who has simply been immersed in it. "Please come in." I came in. I stopped at what seemed like a respectful distance from the platform and stood with my hands at my sides. "I am told," he said, "that you located the structural failure in the throne hall's south support column on the 18th day of the investigation, using a mop handle and a piece of chalk." "Yes," I said. "And that the method, striking the surface and listening for the acoustic return, comes from structural inspection work on Earth." Standard practice for concrete and masonry structures. I wasn't certain it would transfer to crystal. Crystal transmits differently, but the underlying principle holds for any medium where a discontinuity alters the acoustic return. And yet it worked. The laminar separation was there, I said. The method only needed to be sensitive to the frequency where the separation's return appears. A mechanical tap is broadband, it doesn't filter. The velar wand is highly sensitive but narrowband, calibrated for the frequencies most relevant to the common failure modes. This one was in the gap. He was quiet for a moment. I had the sense of a man doing what careful people do when they're hearing something explained properly. Not just receiving the information, but placing it, understanding where it fits with what else he knew. 17 of the finest structural specialists in my court, he said, equipped with instruments that represent the accumulated precision of 6 centuries of Vethaal crystallography, spent 18 days unable to find what you found in 20 minutes. They were looking correctly, I said. The instruments were calibrated correctly for what they were designed to detect. The failure was in a gap in that calibration, a gap that no one had reason to anticipate because this failure mode is uncommon. It isn't a failure of method on their part. It's a gap in the method's coverage, which is different. You are being generous. I'm being accurate, I said. I've worked with engineers who had twice my education and 10 times my equipment, and the things we found together were things neither of us could have found alone. Different training sees different things. That's not a failure on their part. That's just how it works. The value is in having both. He looked at me with the still green eyes. You came into the throne hall without authorization, he said. I did, I said. The door was ajar and I heard someone say they were going to lose the dome. I had something in my pocket that I thought might be worth trying. I used it. Without informing anyone of what you were doing or why. I didn't know if it would work, I said. I didn't want to interrupt 17 specialists to tell them I was going to try tapping the wall with a stick. That seemed like it might not go well. Something happened at the edge of the senior crystallographer's face. Not quite a smile. The Vethaal expression is different from ours, but something in that direction. The Emperor's expression remained steady. The court record, he said, will note your name as the party responsible for identifying the structural threat to the throne hall, with a description of the method used. This is not negotiable. It is a question of historical accuracy, and the record requires it. There is additionally a monetary acknowledgement, which my chamberlain has calculated in recognition of the service rendered. I appreciate the court record, I said. The monetary acknowledgement, I'd like it to go somewhere useful instead. The Palace Maintenance Fund, or an equipment allocation for the crystallography department. Something that isn't coming back to me. He stopped. I don't need it, I said. I have my wage. I was mopping a corridor and I heard something that concerned me and I had the tool in my hand. That isn't exceptional. You shouldn't pay for that. He looked at me for a long, measured moment. The scribe styluses had stilled without their being instructed to still. Why? He said. A genuine question, said the way people ask genuine questions when they're not challenging you but actually want to understand. I thought about how to answer it honestly. Because if you pay me for it, I said, it becomes something remarkable, and I'd rather it was ordinary. I'd rather that paying attention to a structure and using what you have in your hands was just what you do. It shouldn't be remarkable. It should be the baseline. He was quiet. Also, I said, I have the east corridor to finish. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, the east corridor. I have it before the 4th bell, I said. He stood up, not with ceremony, just stood, as a person does when a conversation is complete and they want to mark the end with something more than staying seated. He was very tall, as the Vethaal tend to be, and the morning light from the narrow windows lay pale across his gray robes. You may go, Myra Solon, he said. The court record will note what it notes. The maintenance fund will receive the acknowledgement. He paused. And I will have caretaker Veth look into the mop handle. I paused. The mop handle. Your requisition 6 weeks ago. The handle was too long. I apologize for the delay in addressing it. I stood there for a moment in front of an emperor who had read a maintenance staff requisition form. There is no dignified response to that particularly, so I simply said, "Thank you. That would help," and I picked up my bucket which I had set by the door and went out. The corridor outside the lesser audience chamber was cool and quiet, lit by a strip of pale blue crystal lamp set into the upper wall. My footsteps sounded soft on the polished floor. I started toward the east wing. I thought about what the emperor had said, that the court record would note what it noted, and the maintenance fund would receive the acknowledgement, and I found that I was satisfied with that. Not in a resigned way. In the way you are satisfied when a thing has been arranged correctly. The record would exist because it was true, and because a record that was true was worth having, for the same reason that a structural assessment that was accurate was worth having. It told the next person the right information. If some future crystallographer read the court record and found there a line noting that a percussion tap survey had located a laminar separation that 17 resonance wands had missed, and that crystallographer thought about that and filed it somewhere useful in their training, then the record had done its work. That was enough. That was considerably more than nothing. The east corridor had a section of grout near the third service junction that I had flagged 2 weeks ago, repaired, and wanted to look at again. Old Palace grout has a habit of recracking along the same failure plane if the repair compound doesn't fully key into the original material. You patch it, and 3 weeks later the patch is doing fine on the surface and has begun to separate at the back face, and by the time it's visible again, you've lost another centimeter of depth. I wanted to check the depth, and I wanted to check the humidity reading on the panel above it, because moisture and a compromised grout line in the same section is not a combination you leave alone. I got to the east wing before the 4th bell. The grout section had held. I made a note on my inspection card anyway, marked it for follow-up in 10 days, and went on with the corridor. The structures are telling us things all the time. I have come to think the distinction matters less than most people assume. The fracture was in the column regardless of whether anyone was looking for it. The laminar plane was propagating regardless of whether 17 specialists had spent 18 days failing to find it, or whether a maintenance worker with a chalk stub had found it in 20 minutes. The stone does not care about the hierarchy of the room. It only tells the truth of its own condition, and it tells it to anyone who asks in the right language. What matters is that someone asks. I am not being modest when I say that I don't think what I did was exceptional. I think it was ordinary, in the way that a very particular kind of ordinary is ordinary. The ordinary of a specific skill, developed over years of practice, applied at the moment it was needed. The exceptional thing, if there was one, was that I happened to be there with the skill in the same moment the skill was needed. That happens. It's a version of luck, if you want to call it luck, or a version of preparation meeting circumstance, if you prefer that framing. What I prefer is the simpler framing. I knew how to listen, and there was something to hear. I worked at the Vethaal Imperial Palace for another 4 years after the dome. My corridor assignments rotated through most of the palace complex in that time: North Wing, West Wing, the secondary courts, the administrative passages. I finished in the North Wing, which has the best light. 3 days after the audience with the Emperor, a new mop handle appeared outside my utility closet. The right length, no note. I put it to work on the South Corridor, and my hip was grateful by the end of the week. In the 4th year, I was doing my morning walkthrough of the secondary corridor adjacent to the palace chapel when I noticed something in the chapel's east wall. A very slight irregularity in the way the morning light reflected from the crystal panel at about 2 meters height. A flatness in the reflection. a faint difference in quality from the panels on either side of it. The kind of thing you might not notice if you were walking quickly, or if you had a lot on your mind, or if you had not spent years learning to let your eye move slowly and catch what it catches. I stopped, I looked at it, then I went and got my mop. The tap test returned a very faint secondary resonance from a section about 30 centimeters square, centered at roughly 1.80 meters, the same height as the throne hall column, as it happened, which was probably coincidence, or probably just the structural reality that the growth conditions at that height in a given climate profile produce similar results. Not a structural failure this time. The chapel wall carried no load, but a void in the crystal bonding, the kind that can admit moisture through the outer facing, and over a decade or two, turn a cosmetic issue into something that weakens the interior lattice. I marked it with chalk and filed a report. The repair crew came the next day. One of them was a young crystallographer, not from the palace's own department, from the look of her uniform, likely on a rotation secondment from the academy, the kind of assignment given to newly trained specialists in their first few years. She was perhaps 25 years into her life, barely past childhood by Vethaal measure, and she had the bearing of someone who knew their training well and was still learning how the training sat against the reality of actual work. She stood in the chapel doorway and looked at my chalk marks, and then she looked at me. "You found this," she said. "Tap test," I said. "Secondary resonance returned from a void pocket in the bonding layer. It'll admit moisture through the outer facing if it's not addressed." She looked at the marks. She looked at her resonance wand. She said, carefully, "This technique, the mechanical tap, it's not in our assessment protocols." "No," I said, "it isn't." She looked at the wand again. There was something in her expression that I recognized from a long time ago, the expression of someone who knows their instruments well and is just beginning to wonder what their instruments miss. "Would you show me?" she said. We spent about 40 minutes in the chapel. I tapped and she listened, and I explained what I was hearing and how to distinguish it from the baseline return of sound crystal, the slightly flatter tone, the faint second frequency beneath it, the way the change appears and then is gone as you move past the affected section. She asked good questions. She had good ears, the kind of ears that come from a training that had taught her to listen carefully, and she picked up the distinction faster than I had expected. At the end of 30 minutes, she asked me for the mop handle and worked a section of the adjacent wall herself, moving slowly, tapping in a methodical line from the floor upward, head tilted to hear the returns. I watched her find the baseline and then move past it and come back to it, working the section twice to confirm what she'd heard. Then she found the second void, a section I hadn't gotten to yet, about 2 meters along the same wall, smaller than the first but there. She looked at it for a moment, and then she reached into her coat and took out her chalk and marked it. She stepped back and looked at the 2 marks on the chapel wall, and then she looked at me. "Add it to your protocols," I said. She thought about that. I would have to make a case for it to the department. "Make the case," I said. "You found 2 voids in 40 minutes that the wand wouldn't have shown. That's your case." She looked at the chalk marks, and then at the wand in her other hand, and I watched the thought settle into her. Not a large dramatic settling, not a revelation, but the quiet kind of settling that happens when a fact that should have been obvious arranges itself into a place where you can see it clearly. "All right," she said. I went to get my bucket and finish the corridor. When I looked back from the doorway, she was still in the chapel, moving methodically along the east wall, tapping panel by panel, head tilted, listening. I retired on a Tuesday at the end of a standard shift. Caretaker Veth met me at the maintenance building exit and shook my hand, which was the most demonstrative I had ever seen him be. He told me the north corridor would not be the same. I thanked him and meant it. I had come to genuinely like the north corridor, its particular quality of light, the way the crystal walls there caught the late afternoon sun and held it differently from the south wing, warmer and more amber. I took the transit home. I slept 12 hours without waking, which I had not done since I was perhaps 40. In the morning I made tea and sat at a window and looked out at something ordinary, a courtyard, some low trees, a maintenance drone making its slow circuit around the building, and thought about nothing in particular, and it was fine. It was, in fact, better than fine. The dome is still standing. I check, sometimes, in the public records the Vethaal Post for their major structures. The south column's monitoring readings are nominal. The bonding medium that was injected along the laminar plane has consolidated fully, the crystallography department reported in their last published assessment, and the load path through the dome support structure is properly distributed. The morning light still comes down through the crystal and moves across the mosaic floor in long pale shifts, and the Emperor sits beneath it, and no one in the room thinks about the south column unless they have particular reason to. That is exactly as it should be. A thing repaired well enough becomes invisible again. The structures are telling us things all the time. The stone is always speaking. It speaks to anyone who stops and asks the right question in the right language, and the language is not complicated. It is just the language of your hands and your ears and the patience to listen to what comes back. You can learn it. It takes time and it takes practice, and it takes being willing to look slow and low-tech in front of people with better instruments than you have. But the stone doesn't care about the instruments. The stone only tells the truth of its own condition. That is all I ever had. And it turned out, on one morning in the south maintenance corridor of the Vethaal Imperial Palace, with a chalk stub in my pocket and a too long mop handle in my hand, to be exactly enough.